Hello, it's Scott Manley here. Today it's the 4th of July, which means, of course, it's Independence Day in the United States, a day of celebration where lots of people will be firing off rockets. You know, celebrating the independence of your country by blowing up a piece of it. Anyway, I'm fond of pointing out that the Star Spangled Banner, the national anthem of the United States, contains rockets. It's the only one I can think of. There's a line in the verse which basically says, the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in the air. And many people wonder, well, wait a second, what kind of rocket was that? Indeed, one highly respected individual who I'm a big fan of, and whose name shall remain anonymous, asked what kind of rocket was flying in the 1700s. To which I gotta point out, the Star Spangled Banner was actually written in 1814, after the Battle of Baltimore, right? It commemorated or described the attack by the British on Fort McHenry. So the British were actually avid users of rockets around this era. And they had learned all of this actually from some conflicts in South India. So rewind to the late 1780s. In the south of India, there was a particular king, ruler, whatever, that had gained quite some power. This would be the Mysorean kingdom region. I don't know if it was a kingdom or whatever, but it was definitely, you know, it was causing enough trouble for the East India Company that they went to war with them 4 times. And the first couple of times, the Indians won, the locals won, in part because of their use of rockets. Their rockets were better than anybody else at the time. Now, eventually, samples of these rockets found their way back home to England. And William Congreve, who was the son of William Congreve, who was the guy that ran the Royal Armoury, or the Royal Arsenal, he was quite interested in using rockets as a weapon. He had been buying rockets from local producers in London, and they were paper cased and they could only go a few hundred yards. These rockets, the Mysorean rockets, were able to go like 1,000 yards, right? They used an iron casing so they could get much higher chamber pressures. They were solid rockets using black powder. They had a long stick out the back for stabilization, so they looked like giant oversized fireworks. And then, of course, they would do things like attach swords to them to make them really scary. So William Congreve, having tested these samples, he managed to get some money from the Prince Regent, apparently, who he was supposedly best buddies with at some time. And they improved on this and basically came up with the Congreve rocket, which was ultimately used during the Napoleonic Wars and, of course, the War of 1812. The Congreve rockets were used from ships. Specifically, the Fort McHenry was bombarded by a ship called the HMS Erebus. Apparently, the Erebus was originally built after a design for what was to be a fire ship. Now, a fire ship was essentially a ship that you would set on fire and send it rolling into the enemy ranks, and they were very popular for a while, but by the time the Erebus was built, the tactic had kind of fallen out of favour since everybody knew what was coming and had figured out how to deal with it. So it was converted to be a rocket ship. It carried a lower deck with these 32-pound rockets that could fire all the way, you know, fire fairly long distances. And those are the rockets which are featured in the Star Spangled Banner. So yeah, for about 50 years in the early 1800s, the British Armed Forces were very fond of their rockets. The main advantage was that the rockets could be moved around much more easily than moving a large cannon. They could be fired a lot faster because they hadn't yet invented the breech-loading cannon. But the downside was that they were horrifically inaccurate. They were really more used as kind of terror weapons. They were great at firing into like a city and setting things on fire. They weren't so good at hitting particular targets. But they were so spectacular that they did scare the bejesus out of any enemy that they were facing. And so they were popular for a while. Later, they invented something called, a guy called William Hall invented the Hall rocket, which used an exhaust, used angle exhaust to spin the rocket instead and could get rid of this big long tail stabilizer. So those were used, but by then, really, artillery was catching up with the rockets, and ultimately, of course, rockets were barely used until some guys in Germany decided it was an interesting way to get past the Treaty of Versailles. So yeah, that's what the rockets were in the Star Spangled Banner. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.